Hello, everyone. Today I'm sharing a deeply personal story, one that has haunted me for years. It's a tale of innocence, loss, and an unsettling journey into the truths hidden within my family. This is my story. I was just a boy when it all started. Back then, I didn't think my life was any different from anyone else's. Sure, my father and I lived far from other people, tucked away in an isolated house at the edge of a dense forest, but that was just how life was. It felt normal. Dad was my entire world. He'd tuck me in at night, tell me stories, and make me laugh. He wasn't just a parent, he was my hero. But there were rules, strict ones, the kind that weren't negotiable. The biggest one, never talk to the visitors. Sean, he'd say, his voice firm but caring, if you ever hear anyone calling for you, if you hear whispers or see shapes in the shadows, you must ignore them. They're not real. And if you ever talk to them, I'll know. I was too young to question him. Why would I? Dad always knew what was best, but still, I wondered. Who were these visitors he spoke of? Were they ghosts, angels, monsters? I didn't dare ask. His warnings were enough to keep my curiosity at bay, for a while at least. One night I was lying in bed when I first heard it. A soft voice, barely a whisper, calling my name. Sean. Sean. I froze, my heart raced, and my tiny fists clenched the blanket. Was this a visitor? I couldn't tell, but it didn't feel threatening. In fact, it felt familiar even. Against my better judgment, I whispered back, "Who's there?" The voice didn't answer right away. Then after what felt like an eternity, it said, "I'm Alex." Alex, a simple name, but it sent chills down my spine. I didn't know any Alex, yet the voice sounded so calm, so kind. "What do you want?" I whispered. "I'm lost," the voice said. "Can you help me?" I didn't know what to do. I was just a kid. How could I help anyone? But before I could respond, the door to my room swung open, and there stood Dad. His face wasn't angry, but it was serious. Too serious. "Sean," he said quietly but firmly, "who were you talking to?" I panicked. "No one," I blurted out. "I wasn't talking to anyone." He stepped closer, kneeling by my bed. "Sean, you know the rule. If you talk to them, they'll come back, and they'll never leave." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that he was protecting me from something terrible. But as he sat beside me that night, explaining once again why I had to ignore the visitors, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he was letting on. Who was Alex? And why did she sound so desperate? My father never gave me answers, just more warnings. He told me I'd be punished if I broke the rule again. Not because he wanted to hurt me, but because he had to keep me safe. Safe from what, though? That question lingered in my mind for years. As the days turned into weeks, the peculiarities of my childhood became sharper in my memory. My father had always been an enigma, loving yet strangely distant, with moods that shifted like the seasons. His strict rules and the way he isolated me from the outside world now seemed more deliberate than I ever realized back then. He used to say that the world outside was full of dangers, that it was better for me to stay with him where I was safe. At the time, I believed him. I trusted him. After all, he was my father, my only connection to the world. But there was something else that made our life together unique, something I didn't realize wasn't normal until much later. I had visitors. These were voices, faint at first, but growing louder over time, that would speak to me when I was alone. I remember one night vividly. I was lying in bed, staring into the void of my darkness. That's when I heard it, the soft voice of a girl calling my name. It wasn't scary or threatening, it was curious, almost as if she was lost and looking for someone to guide her. "Who are you?" I asked hesitantly, unsure if my father would hear me talking to no one again. "Her name was Ellie," she said. She sounded young, maybe a little older than me. She told me she liked to sing and would hum a little tune now and then. It was comforting in a way that nothing else in my world had been. But Ellie wasn't the only one. Soon, I began to hear others, boys and girls with stories that felt fragmented, incomplete. They weren't like the adults who visited our home for business. These voices were only for me, and they felt more real than I could explain. I didn't dare tell my father, not at first. He didn't like things he couldn't control, and I had learned early on to keep my thoughts to myself. But one evening, I slipped. "I was talking to Ellie today," I blurted out during dinner. My father froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. The silence was suffocating. "Who's Ellie?" he finally asked, his voice sharp. I realized too late that I had made a mistake. She's just a friend, I stammered. He put his fork down and stared at me, his expression unreadable. There's no one here but us, Sean. You know that. But she's real, I protested. She talks to me when you're not around. That was the first time I saw a different side of him, a side that scared me. He wasn't angry, not yet. Instead, he was cold, calculating. He leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. Sean, you must never talk about Ellie or anyone else like her again. Do you understand me? I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. I didn't understand why he was so upset, but I knew better than to argue. From that day on, I kept the visitors a secret. I still heard them, still spoke to them when I was alone, but I never mentioned them to my father again. Looking back now, I realize how much he feared them. Not the visitors themselves, but what they represented. They were cracks in the carefully constructed world he had built for us, and he couldn't allow that world to crumble. But the cracks were there, and they were growing. And I couldn't stop myself from wondering, who were these voices? Why did they come to me? And what was my father so afraid of? The visitors became a part of my everyday life, their voices weaving through my solitude like threads in a tapestry. Ellie was the most persistent, always curious, always gentle. But then came Alex. Alex was different. Her voice was stronger, more confident, and she had this way of making me feel like I wasn't alone. She'd tell me stories about places she'd been, parks, schools, streets bustling with life. It was a world I had only ever imagined, a world that felt just out of reach. Why don't you go outside, Sean? She asked me one day. My dad says it's not safe, I replied. But how do you know that's true? She countered, her voice tinged with defiance. I didn't have an answer. I had never questioned my father before. He was my guide, my protector, the one who knew best. But Alex's words planted a seed of doubt. The more I spoke to her, the more questions I began to have. Why was I always kept inside? Why didn't I have friends or go to school like other kids? Why did my father get so angry whenever I mentioned the visitors? One day I decided to ask him, Dad, why can't I go outside? He looked at me, his expression carefully neutral. It's not safe for you out there, Sean. You wouldn't understand. But Alex says, I didn't even get to finish my sentence. His hand slammed down on the table, making me jump. Alex isn't real, he shouted. His face was red, his eyes blazing with an anger I had never seen before. You need to stop this nonsense, Sean. These imaginary friends of yours are dangerous. I didn't understand why he was so upset. They weren't dangerous. They were my friends. They kept me company in a world that was otherwise empty. But that night, something changed. I woke up to the sound of voices, not just Alex or Ellie, but others. They were louder than before, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Sean, one of them whispered, you need to leave. Leave? Why? I whispered back. But before I could get an answer, my bedroom door flew open. My father stood there, his silhouette backlit by the dim hallway light. Who are you talking to? He demanded. No one, I lied, my voice trembling. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity before walking over to my bed. He knelt down, his voice soft but firm. Sean, you're my son. I only want what's best for you. But these voices, they're not real. They're a trick your mind is playing on you. I wanted to believe him, I really did, but how could they not be real? I could hear them, feel their presence. They were as real to me as my father was. That night, I lay awake for hours, torn between my father's words and the voices that called out to me. I didn't know who to trust anymore. And then, something happened that I'll never forget. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see my father, but there was no one there. Sean, Alex's voice came, barely a whisper. You're not alone. Remember that. It was comforting, yet it filled me with a deep sense of unease. What did she mean? Why did she sound so urgent? I didn't know it then, but the visitors were trying to tell me something. And soon I would begin to uncover the truth, a truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life, my father, and myself. After that night, things between my father and me were never the same. There was a tension in the house, an unspoken battle between the world he wanted me to believe in and the one I was starting to see for myself. The visitors didn't stop. If anything, they grew bolder, their whispers turning into full conversations. Ellie told me stories about her family, how she missed them, how she wished she could see them again. Alex encouraged me to question everything, to see beyond the walls my father had built around me. But it wasn't just their words. Strange things began to happen. Objects would go missing and then reappear in places I'd never put them. Lights would flicker for no reason. Once I woke up to find my bedroom door open, even though I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening, something my father didn't want me to understand. One evening, I gathered the courage to confront him. "Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the fear twisting in my stomach, "why don't you want me to talk to them?" He froze, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. "Them? You know who I mean," I said. "Ellie, Alex, the others." For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he sighed and sat down across from me. "Sean," he began, his voice weary, "I've tried to protect you. Your mother, she believed in things like that. She thought there were spirits, visitors, whatever you want to call them. But it drove her mad." I stared at him, my mind racing. My mother? He never talked about her. All I knew was that she had died when I was a baby. "What do you mean?" I asked. She started seeing things, hearing voices. She was convinced they were real, but they weren't, Sean. They weren't. His words were desperate, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "But what if they are real?" I countered. "What if they're trying to tell us something?" He slammed his fist on the table, making me jump. "No, Sean, you can't think like that. It's dangerous." Dangerous. That word stuck with me. What was so dangerous about the visitors? Why was he so afraid? That night, I made a decision. If my father wouldn't tell me the truth, I would find it myself. I started paying closer attention to the visitors, asking them questions about who they were and why they were here. Ellie told me about the day she disappeared, how she'd been playing in her yard when a man approached her. Alex shared her own story, her voice filled with pain and anger. And then, one night, I heard a new voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but as I focused, it grew louder. "Sean," it said, "you have to find the box." "The box?" I whispered. "Yes," the voice replied. "It's hidden in the basement. It has the answers you're looking for." I didn't hesitate. As soon as I was sure my father was asleep, I crept downstairs. The basement was cold and dark, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. I searched for what felt like hours, my hands brushing against dusty shelves and old boxes. And then, in the corner, I found it. A small wooden box, its surface worn and scratched. I opened it, my heart pounding. Inside were papers, photos, and a few trinkets. As I sorted through them, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The photos were of children, Ellie, Alex, and others I didn't recognize. There were newspaper clippings about missing kids, dates that matched the stories the visitors had told me. And then I found a journal. It was my father's. The entries were fragmented, filled with guilt and fear. He wrote about trying to protect me, about wanting to keep me safe from the world. But he also wrote about the visitors, how they wouldn't leave him alone, how they blamed him for what happened. By the time I closed the box, I felt like I couldn't breathe. My father wasn't just hiding the truth. He was a part of it. The visitors weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real, and they were trying to tell me something, something I wasn't ready to hear. The discovery in the basement haunted me. The faces in the photographs, the stories I had heard from the visitors, and my father's fragmented journal, it all pointed to a truth I wasn't sure I could handle. But one thing was clear. My father had lied to me, and his lies had shaped my entire life. The next morning I confronted him. "Dad," I said, holding the journal in one hand and the photos in the other. "What is this?" His face turned pale, and for a moment I thought he might faint. He looked at the items in my hands as if they were ghosts themselves. "Where did you find that?" he whispered. "In the basement," I replied. "You lied to me, about Ellie, about Alex, about everything." He didn't deny it. Instead, he sank into the nearest chair, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. "I did it for you," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "You don't understand, Sean. You were so young. I didn't know how to explain." "Explain what?" I demanded. "That you knew what happened to them? That you let me think they were just voices in my head? That you were part of this?" Tears welled up in his eyes, but I couldn't feel pity for him. "Not now." "I didn't hurt them," he said, shaking his head. "I swear to you, Sean, I didn't hurt those children." "Then who did?" He hesitated, and I could see the war raging within him, the need to protect me versus the need to unburden himself. Finally, he said, "There was a man, someone I used to know. He brought them here." "Brought them here?" I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "Why would you let him do that?" "I didn't have a choice," he shouted, his voice cracking. "He threatened us, me, you. I thought I could keep you safe if I just looked the other way." The room fell silent, his words hanging heavy in the air. "You let him hurt them," I said, my voice trembling. "You let him take them away, and you did nothing." He buried his face in his hands, sobbing. "I thought I could protect you," he whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." But his excuses meant nothing to me. The damage was done. That night, the visitors came to me again. Ellie and Alex were there, their voices filled with a mix of sadness and urgency. "You know now," Alex said. "You know what happened." "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "He's my father. How can I turn against him?" "You already have," Ellie said gently. "By listening to us, by seeking the truth, you've already taken the first step. But what do I do next?" I asked. "Help us," Alex said. "Help us find peace." Their words echoed in my mind as I tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. I kept seeing their faces, hearing their voices. The next day, I made a decision. I would go to the authorities. I gathered everything I had found in the basement, the photos, the clippings, the journal, and hid them in my room. Then, I waited for the right moment. When my father left the house to run errands, I took the box and headed to the nearest police station. The officers listened as I told them everything, the visitors, the photos, the journal. At first, they looked at me with skepticism, but as I laid out the evidence, their expressions shifted. They promised to investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. To them, I was just a blind boy with a wild imagination. But I knew the truth. And so did the visitors. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time, I had taken control. I had done what I could to honor Ellie and Alex and the others. But I also knew this wasn't the end. The truth had a way of unraveling slowly, like a thread pulled from a tightly woven fabric. And as much as I wanted to believe I had done enough, I could feel the weight of the unfinished story pressing down on me. The visitors weren't done with me. Not yet. The weight of the truth didn't ease as I handed the evidence over to the police. If anything, it grew heavier. The visitors didn't leave me alone. Ellie, Alex, and others whose names I didn't even know, they stayed, their presence lingering like shadows I couldn't escape. I thought that revealing what I knew would silence them, but instead, it only deepened my connection to their pain. The police began their investigation. Days turned into weeks, and I felt the tension growing at home. My father knew something was wrong. He wasn't stupid. He noticed my quiet defiance, my distance, my refusal to let his lies define me anymore. And then, one evening, he confronted me. "Sean," he said, his voice tight with suspicion. "What have you done?" I didn't flinch. "I told the truth," I replied, staring straight ahead. "Something you couldn't do." His face twisted with anger, but there was something else there too. Fear. He knew the walls were closing in. "You don't understand what you've done," he hissed. "You've put yourself in danger. Put us in danger." "No," I said firmly. "I've put an end to this. To your lies. To the pain you caused." For the first time, I saw him for who he truly was. Not a protective father, not a grieving widower, but a man consumed by his own weakness. A man who had let his fear control him, even when it cost innocent lives. He didn't argue. He didn't try to justify himself. He just turned and walked away. That night, the visitors came to me again. "You did it," Ellie said. "You set it in motion." "Is it enough?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Will you finally find peace?" Alex hesitated. "We don't know," she admitted, "but it's a start." Her words haunted me as much as their presence. Would it ever be enough? Would the truth ever truly heal the wounds left behind? A few days later, the police returned with news. They had found evidence, real, undeniable proof, in the basement. My father's lies had finally unraveled completely. He was arrested that same evening. I listened from the porch as the officers led him away. He didn't resist. He didn't even speak. I thought I would feel relief, closure, but all I felt was emptiness. In the weeks that followed, the story made headlines. My father's crimes became a spectacle for the media, dissected and debated by people who had no idea what it was like to live in that house, to live with his lies. But I stayed out of it. I couldn't bear to be part of the circus. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life. Aunt Laura became a constant presence. She helped me navigate the chaos, offering a steady hand when I needed it most. She took me to doctors who evaluated my eyes and explained what could be done. The surgeries were terrifying, but I agreed to them, not because I wanted to see the world, but because I wanted to see the truth. When the bandages came off for the last time, I cried. My vision wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make out shapes and colors, enough to see the world I had been denied for so long. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, a flicker of hope. As for the visitors, they began to fade. Slowly, gradually, their voices grew quieter. Ellie's laughter, Alex's questions, the murmurs of the others, they became distant echoes, like a song you hear from another room. I think they found peace in the end. Now, years later, I find myself standing on the porch of that old house again. The memories still linger, but they don't haunt me the way they used to. Kim is beside me, her presence grounding me. "Are you ready?" she asks gently. I nod. I think so. We step inside together, and for the first time, I face the past without fear. The echoes are still there, but they no longer hold power over me. And as I walk through the house, I realize something I never thought possible. I am free. Years have passed since that chapter of my life closed. It feels like another world now, distant, like a memory from someone else's story. But the scars remain, reminders of the lies and pain I once lived with. I stand outside the house where it all began, the place that held so many secrets. The house is empty now, boarded up and abandoned, but its presence still looms large in my mind. Kim is here with me. She gives me a small nod, encouraging but not pressing. "Take your time," she says softly. I step forward, crossing the threshold into a space that once felt like a prison. The air inside is stale, the walls peeling, but the weight of the past seems lighter now. Memories flood back, the sound of my father's voice, the way he made me doubt the world outside. The visitors, Ellie and Alex, their whispers guiding me to truths I wasn't ready to face. But there's no fear anymore. I walk through the house, room by room, each step a confrontation with the past. The basement door stands ajar, and for a moment, I hesitate. It's down there where so much pain was hidden, where the truth was buried. But I don't need to go down anymore. I've already unearthed what needed to be found. Instead, I return to the front porch, where Kim waits patiently. She knows I'm still figuring that out. "This place doesn't feel like home," I admit. "Not anymore." She nods. "It's just a house, Sean. The home is what you make for yourself now." Her words settle over me, a quiet truth that feels like a gift. As we prepare to leave, I glance back one last time. The house seems smaller somehow, its shadows less threatening. I don't hear the visitors anymore. They've gone, leaving behind only silence. Kim and I walk to the car, and as I slide into the passenger seat, I feel the faintest sense of closure. The road ahead isn't clear. It's full of unknowns, just like everyone's life. For the first time, I'm not afraid of it. As we drive away, I let the memories stay behind, locked away in that empty house. The echoes of my father, of Ellie and Alex, of the life I left behind, they're no longer chains. They're part of my story, yes, but they no longer define me. I'm free to write my own future now, one step at a time. And for the first time in years, I'm ready to begin. Bugs and spiders scatter as he tugs open the creaking wooden bulkhead doors and peers down into the darkness. "There's a light at the bottom of the stairs," she tells him. "Just feel for the string and give it a pull." He carefully tests the strength of each squeaking step as he descends into the damp shadows of his neighbor's cellar. Mrs. Wilkes thinks he's her grandson and often asks him to help with odd jobs around the yard. Today, she wants him to trim back the dead patches in the ivy cascading over the trellis. Her voice, as frail now as her gaunt, shrinking frame, drifts down from the top of the steps. "The clippers should be right there on the workbench, dear. Your grandfather always kept them on the workbench." He rakes his hand through layers of web before finding the string. When he pulls it, a single glass bulb flickers yellow for a moment before the filament crumbles, plunging him back into near darkness. Only the pale daytime glow from above illuminates the space behind him. In the dim light, he spots the sagging workbench against the far wall. It's cluttered with glass jars, rusting coffee cans, and a mix of tools, the remnants of a once dedicated craftsman now reduced to dusty relics of a forgotten era. Arms outstretched, he waves through the cobwebs hanging in his path. The clippers are exactly where she said they would be, but the wooden handles are loose, worn thin with age, and the steel blades are rusted shut. He traces the rough edges with his fingers and calls up to her. "I don't think these are going to work, Mrs. Wilkes. I can just grab my own. They'll do the job just fine." "Hello?" Her wavering voice calls down from above. "Is somebody down there?" "It's me, Mrs. Wilkes," he says, turning back toward the stairs. "I was just looking for the clippers." "Oh dear," she mutters faintly, as if to herself. "Who could have left this open?" The hinges groan, and the square of light above him begins to shrink. "Wait," he shouts, lunging toward the stairs. The doors slam shut, cutting off the light entirely. For a moment, all is silent. Then, in the heavy, consuming darkness, he hears the soft, deliberate clicking of a lock. The seamstress clips crow wings in the woods each night. I've heard but never seen it myself until now how she breaks their bones. Crow feathers spiral like leaves in the moonlight. "Leave the poor thing alone, dear," I say. The seamstress's flawless skin appears younger than mine, but her hands slice through the bird's wing with practiced ease. "Your words belong to someone else," she says, her mouth moving even when no words are spoken. I cannot tell stillness from speech, lost in the way the night air breathes and how curiously her lips curl. I know that sometimes when I open my mouth, an 89-year-old woman speaks out. One particular 89-year-old woman. Pain is in the details. The seamstress splits the soft skin of the wing, tearing through the fine membranes. I hear the bird cry out. I realize it's still alive. The seamstress holds a needle in hand, threading it with silver string that gleams in the dark. This was once a crow too, tendons, so fine when separate, little more than hair, strong when woven together. Across my fractured memories, my grandmother sits with her needlework, threads of red and green, patches on the table beside her. We play in the yard on Elm Street, not far from the forest. By we, I mean me. She watches through cracked glasses, lenses scarred from falls and tumbles. She doesn't bother replacing them, says they already replaced her eyes, and a person can't expect second chances, says some things age and are gone. "Grandma, I'm building a castle. Watch me." Grandma's watching, dear. I pile bricks on top of one another, trying to stack them up to my knees. But the rough bricks won't stay no matter how I stack them. They tumble down as soon as I try. On the ground in the woods beside the seamstress, the crow is silent now. I can't hear it breathe. "Grandma?" The bricks have fallen. They lie still, and I wonder if Grandma has seen. "Breathe." The seamstress says, her words a murmur of crow feathers, her breath like the cool night air. "Poor thing," my grandmother says, her face pale, her eyes watching but not seeing me. I don't know who's poor now, the dead or those left behind. The seamstress closes the crow's eyes. "They see too much in the dark. You must close their eyes so they can sleep." She's not asleep, I say, and I know there are bricks all around my feet, broken castles, scattered memories. The seamstress hums as she sews, a song my grandmother might have sung, about oaks and winter and frost. My grandmother lies on the ground, still as stone. My house is just a few blocks away, but I am young, and my thoughts are towers and walls, at least 7 worlds away. I don't know where or how to begin. "Aren't you going to ask what I'm making?" the seamstress says between soft tunes. "See how we make things new?" She's woven the crow's feathers into a patchwork quilt, cutting and resewing the pieces from the wings. In the darkness of the midnight hour, the body nearly vanishes. I see a cloak or a blanket or the night sky pieced together in the seamstress's arms. "We're making things new," my grandmother said when she took me to the yard, sat down with her sewing, and set me building walls. "See how we thread or weave, grow, something beautiful." "Something beautiful," the seamstress says. Her eyes catch the moonlight. They gleam feline in their intensity. Lost, I reach for the quilt in her arms, then the wingless body beside it, bristling fur beneath my hands. My skin will toughen, I know. "Crack a bone," the seamstress commands. But her words may be a song, a melody, a memory. The bone cracks and I begin to sew. A baby bit Clara's heart, and then her heart turned black. Her heart had been a live, beating thing. It had led her first to Daniel, and then to the white waiting room with little wooden blocks painted in primary colors. On the car ride home, Daniel and Clara clasped hands, a cotton ball taped to the crook of her elbow. Clara was as soft and buttery as the nursery walls they would soon paint lavender. It had been their honeymoon. Daniel unlocked the beachfront villa's door with a metallic click, then carried Clara over the threshold of the room. The bedspread was floral and smelled faintly of sea salt and bleach. There were 2 twin beds, 2 matching lamps, and a painting of a sunset that stretched just beyond the window. The painting hung askew, the colors dulled by age. Daniel pushed the beds together and straightened the painting before turning to Clara with a grin. Clara stripped and stood naked. The air conditioner hummed, the room damp with the ocean's breath, her skin damp with want and the weight of Daniel's gaze. Then came his hands, then his body. Afterward, they lounged on the villa's terrace, sipping icy drinks, listening to the distant waves and cicadas' rhythmic drone. Clara felt weightless, as if she had dissolved into the breeze, her form bent and reshaped in that small, humid room. Everything, the sun, the scent of salt in the air, the pitch of insects, passed through her, whatever she had been before now excised and offered to something vast and intangible. Daniel spoke to her stomach, his lips brushing against her skin as if whispering a spell. Clara's body began to change, doubling her blood supply and giving away pieces of itself to nurture something unseen. She ate liver and rare cuts of meat, the richness fortifying her as she moved through days blurred by nausea and restless nights. Descending the stairs to do laundry, her bones felt loose within her, her joints aching with the weight of creation. The house filled with pale, soft things, blankets embroidered with delicate animals, tiny cotton onesies, and a mobile of plush stars and moons. Clara's hair thickened, her skin glowed with an otherworldly sheen, and then her teeth began to ache. One fell out, then another, the enamel stripped by the acid that bubbled within her. Her gums throbbed, her tongue raw from the metallic taste of her own body's sacrifices. Daniel combed her hair with an ivory-handled brush each evening, humming lullabies as Clara drifted into shallow, uneasy sleep. The birth was inevitable, not an event, but a culmination. It was a bright spring morning, after a night steeped in pain and muted cries. The baby emerged red and squalling, her fingers curling like tiny talons, her legs thin and trembling. Her stomach was round, her eyes wide with unspoken knowing. When the umbilical cord was cut, Clara felt the severance in her soul, as if the child had taken more than blood and milk, but some part of Clara's essence. The baby latched onto Clara's breast with fervor, drinking deeply. Her tiny limbs moved ceaselessly, the same restless energy that had filled Clara's womb now visible. As the child thrived, growing pink and plump, Clara withered. Her hair fell out in dark handfuls, wrapping around her wrists and ankles, a binding of invisible threads. Her blood thinned, her skin turned pale, and her body became a hollow shell. Clara moved through days like a ghost, tending to the baby's endless needs. Daniel took over when he could, cradling their daughter against his chest, singing softly as he rocked her to sleep. He warmed bottles of milk in his palms, his eyes distant and clouded with dreams of a simpler, happier time. Clara watched him from the shadows, her heart growing heavier with each passing moment. She felt as if she were dissolving, her edges blurring, her presence fading from the fabric of their lives. By the time the baby turned 1, Clara had become a stranger to herself. She bled monthly again, her body's cycles returning even as her spirit remained suspended. One day, while Daniel was away, Clara left their daughter with her mother and walked into a sterile clinic. She lay on the operating table as the surgeon counted backward from 10, her last thought of the crescent moons the procedure would leave on her hips. When she woke, she felt nothing but relief. Her body would no longer betray her, no longer create and give and empty itself for another. Summer arrived, and Clara set up a plastic pool in their backyard, filling it with cool water for the baby. She sat in a faded lounge chair, watching as her daughter splashed and laughed, her golden curls glinting in the sunlight. The sound shimmered in the air, mixing with the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Clara's heart had already turned black by then, though she couldn't pinpoint the moment it had happened. It wasn't the honeymoon or the birth or even the sacrifices her body had made. It was something deeper, something intrinsic to the act of giving until there was nothing left. She sat there, the sun warm on her skin, the laughter of her child ringing in her ears, and she felt only emptiness. Hey girl, we haven't talked in forever. How have you been? Just hosted a makeover party for your Aunt Trisha. Wish you could have been there so we could catch up. Everyone had such a nice time. Really fixed the vibes with your Uncle Albert. Dude went from Hail Satan, prepare for enslavement of the morally righteous, and torture most foul, to just watching the game, dear, real quick. Hey babe, since we couldn't catch up at Albert's makeover, I wanted to let you know how I found financial freedom at 25. I'm proud to say I started my own business last year. It's so easy to fit exorcism into my life wherever I go. Reach out to me anytime to learn how to become your own hashed girl boss. The best decision I could have made as a busy mommy was becoming an independent exorcist. Hey again, you didn't ask, so I thought I'd let you know about all the perks that come with my job. As a top seller, Exorcisme gifted me a brand new pink hearse. It even came with a coffin-shaped car seat for Briley. I bring her along to all my parties. Nothing makes me feel like a boss babe more than driving my hearse with the windows rolled down. Gotta have transportation on hand for clients who won't buy the products you recommend. Excited to announce that Briley is the newest member of the Exorcisme team. Everyone keeps asking if there are any rules against recruiting children, and well, there's no rules that say you can't. Becoming an independent exorcist is for anyone who is hardworking and passionate about what they do, even if they still need their hot dogs cut into pennies or are still learning how to read. Briley sounded out the banishing spell all on her own today. My girl is slaying and getting hands-on learning experience at the same time. None of the lawyers harassing Exorcisme about child endangerment and forced labor seem to be setting their children up for future success. Just in, Exorcisme Hella Glam 3-in-1 Travel Party Kit, complete with 100% Egyptian beeswax black invocation candles, 24K gold crucifix, and clary sage bundles. Order today for a free gift, our limited edition faux mink false lashes. Personally, I can say they're the best lashes I've ever worn. I wouldn't be caught dead looking dull in front of anyone, including Beelzebub. P.S. You may have heard of the unfounded claims that our exorcisms are not safe and our products have unleashed the 10th circle of hell right here in Utah. The company claims no responsibility for exorcisms performed without the Exorcisme Floating Charm Entrapment Locket, which holds up to 5 demon souls, $49.95 plus tax. Death may occur if not used in conjunction with Exorcist Chieftain's Ring, sold separately, $78.95 plus tax. Another successful makeover. Today's spawn of Satan unleashed a lightning strike that burned down the hostess' entire house. At least I had the Exorcisme Micellar Holy Water, $24.95 plus tax. Sold an entire pallet to the fire department when the demon Belial devoured both the hydrant and engine in one chomp. They stopped the blaze just before it became a forest fire, and now the Salt Lake County fire crew can easily remove their makeup in one swipe. Soft as a fallen angel cotton rounds sold separately, $26.95 plus tax. You know where to find me if you want to get your hands on some before it's all gone. What a week. Just finished a makeover for the most difficult client yet. It turned out to be one of those demons who demands child sacrifices for the second coming of the Dark Lord or whatever. Good thing Briley was there. I'll miss getting her commissions, though. She was becoming quite the successful little exorcist. Guess I can always pop out another recruit. Hey girl, it's Satan. Just took care of your friend because even I was getting tired of her bullshit. Don't worry, she's dancing in red-hot iron shoes inside a cage. Not even the Exorcisme Hex melting serum can break open. Even with her mouth sewn shut, that boss bitch somehow convinced me to buy the entire set. And guess what? It's all crap. The gates of hell are always open for hardworking, passionate girl bosses. Anyway, let me know if you're interested in an opportunity to make 7 figures working from home with no experience necessary. You were born during the summer of locusts, Tyler's mother would explain when he asked why he was different, why he was the way he was. But it never made sense. He had no long, beefy hopper legs, no antennae, no thorax, no wings. Rather, his lower portions were hardened exoskeleton with an orifice. Encased inside, along with his human innards, were two reservoirs containing separate chemicals. A sphincter could squeeze the chemicals into a mixing chamber, which would then explode out the orifice. Tyler was part bombardier beetle, and that's all he knew in life. The rest of him was the skin and flesh of man, human face, human hands, human legs. He could hide his beetle parts under clothing, but sometimes they revealed themselves. Tyler could barely remember the first time it happened. "I told you not to play with matches," his mom said as she smothered his bedding and doused his wood bed frame with water. But he had no matches, no lighter, or anything but his nighttime dreams. He was potty training when hot acid around the boiling point of water shot out of his orifice. It burned through his training shorts, torched his bed, and seared the carpet of his room. The noxious smell of burned shag and smoke remained for months, a reminder of the danger he posed, a reminder that he would not fit in this world. The hot acid of Tyler's beetle loins remained inactive for many years. He chalked it up to the childhood phase of learning to wake and relieve himself when the urge presented. Tyler was a good boy, did what he was told, followed the program, and went to college to learn from those supposedly much smarter and more normal than him. Drinking buddies and good old times were his only way to forget who he really was under his denim pants and baggy flannel shirts. Untucked, always untucked, so no one would notice the irregular angles of his exoskeleton. In line at their favorite campus bar, Tyler and his pals waited for the bouncer to collect cover and weed out unwelcomes. A young woman with a short enough skirt and a fake ID cut in line, as many ladies were allowed to do, when Tyler could feel the chemicals mixing in his abdomen. Before he could excuse himself to the bathroom, she looked back to him and winked. The explosion burned through Tyler's pants, shot hot acid on the fellow in front of him, ignited his jacket, and burned his clothes and the back of his scalp. Tyler fled, only to turn himself in later when he saw the news. Arsonist burned clubgoers at local watering hole, facing possible assault charges. His defense attorney said the government had a deal for him he had to take. One tour in Iraq and they'd drop the case. Tyler hated the sand and heat, hated that his country was in another foreign war that he might have to kill. But perhaps this was where he belonged, in a faraway, war-torn land where the atrocities surrounding him were much worse than his accidental torchings back home. "Door kicker," he told the sergeant upon induction. "At 6'2", you're too tall to be a door kicker," Sergeant replied. "Door kickers are under 5'7". Why would you want to be first in any way?" "I can burn things," Tyler said. "What? Burn things? I can burn things. And I have protection." Tyler stood, unzipped his BDUs, and pulled up his shirt, revealing his exoskeleton. He knocked his knuckles against his pelvic area. "See, hard as a rock. And when I'm excited or anxious, angry or scared, I shoot hot acid, almost like boiling apple juice, that will melt the enemy's faces." "What in God's name are you, son?" Sergeant said. "Sir, I don't know, sir. My mom said locust, but I think I'm part bombardier beetle." "Still, you're too tall. We can put you right behind a door kicker. From the angle of your hole, or whatever that is, it seems you could shoot that acid juice over the kicker. He'd have to crouch, but that 1-2 combo, kick and spray, could be just what we need." "Yes, sir." Upon discharge, Tyler returned to the States, but he knew there was no place for him in society anymore. He retreated to Crestview, later becoming a hermit living in a cave in the cliffs near Windy Point. Occasionally, ferry riders or whale-watching tourists would spot him on the shore. They'd wave, he'd wave back, and then he'd disappear into the cliffs where he could not hurt anyone. He wore his gray hair in a ponytail. A loose burlap sack covered his exoskeleton area. As he aged, it began to crack, and when chemicals began leaking into hot puddles while he slept, burning his human skin, he knew it was his time. Tyler went to the highest cliff and looked down at the crashing waves. The drop was far, the sharp granite rocks unforgiving. He was sure even his rigid bug parts would splatter. He took a deep breath and looked off to the Pacific, as peaceful as it had ever been. Where the shallow greenish water turned to deep blue, he first noticed it, a dark cloud. Then he heard it, a buzz. The dark cloud on this cloudless day became bigger. The buzzing intensified. He knew what it was. Thousands of small insects humming toward him as fast as their wings could carry them. Locusts. He stepped back from the cliff. He held his arms wide to welcome them. As the black mass swarmed and tore in, he smiled. He no longer had to worry about hurting others or himself. Tyler, part man, part bombardier beetle, somehow born and taken by locust, was finally free. Sometimes the toads would just sit out on the lawn, a choreographed semicircle of horror, reverberating their growl groans around our white clapboard house in a way that tickled my spine. If I had enough courage, I'd shine our biggest flashlight out into their direction, daring myself to see their unblinking eyes reflected back at me. I became fixated on the cane toads at the same time my grandfather got sick. They provided a strange, almost grotesque distraction from the sadness that seeped under every door and drifted through the suffocating summer air that clung to every wall of our home. The other distraction was my neighbor, Caleb. He was older than me and seemed to know more about everything. Often we talked about the toads. He said there were plenty of ways to kill them. You could sprinkle salt on them and they'd slowly shrivel. You could smash them with a golf club or a baseball bat. But the most humane way, Caleb told me, was to catch them in a plastic bag and put them in the freezer. I thought about our freezer. It was small, crammed with chicken tenders and cherry popsicles, which my mom always kept stocked during the blistering heat of summer. Since my grandfather got sick, my mom started buying them every week. She'd wink at me after dinner each night, her unspoken cue for me to grab one. Most nights after dinner, I sat with Caleb on the porch, armed with our flashlights, sometimes talking, often in silence. "How's your granddad?" "Not good." A low grunt came from the bushes. I shone the flashlight, but nothing moved. "Where do you think they even came from?" "What?" "The toads." "I don't know." "The woods?" I thought about the question a lot when I couldn't sleep. Why were those gnarled, grotesque creatures even here? Different people had different explanations. My mom, a biologist, told me that settlers brought sugar cane, which attracted cane beetles. To control the beetles, they brought the cane toads, but things quickly spiraled out of control. "And what's going to come to eat the cane toads?" I asked her one night. She sighed, shaking her head. "Go eat your popsicle, sweetheart." My grandfather wasn't a scientist. One sunny afternoon, as he sat on the porch sipping tea, I asked him the same question. He chuckled softly and told me the story of Pandora's box, how temptation led to opening it, unleashing all the world's suffering and pestilence. "The cane toads must have been in there too," he joked, smiling faintly. That evening, I relayed his story to Caleb. He didn't seem impressed. "Time to practice getting rid of them. Go on." He handed me a plastic bag. I stared at it for a long moment before inching toward the croaks, his flashlight illuminating the patchy grass just enough. Gathering my courage, I lunged and caught one, enveloping its leathery, writhing body in the bag. I was surprised by how sluggish it was. Twisting the bag tight, I carried it back to Caleb, the toad thrashing with unnerving strength. "What now?" "Just hit it on something to knock it out first." I hesitated before lightly tapping the bag against the ground. It didn't slow down much. Heart pounding, I rushed inside and shoved the bag into the freezer, slamming the door shut. Then I went to bed, my mind racing with questions. Where had they come from? Why were they here? Through the night, I could hear my grandfather coughing, the click of lights switching on and off, and in my half-sleep, the distant wail of an ambulance siren. In the morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter from my mom. She'd taken my grandfather to the hospital. I sat with Caleb on the porch for most of the day, neither of us saying much. By evening, they still hadn't come home. In moments like that, I craved comfort, a cherry popsicle. The thought of it tugged at me until I finally gave in. Sweat dripping down my back, I walked into the kitchen, stood before the freezer, and wrapped my hand around the handle. With a deep breath, I opened the door. There, poised sloppily on the frosty wrapper of my popsicles, sat the toad. Its unblinking eyes stared back at me, its toes curled awkwardly like the color of mud. My heart stopped as its eyelids slowly closed and opened again. I slammed the freezer shut. Outside, in the bushes, the unseen toads grunted in unison, their calls echoing through the humid evening air like a chorus of triumph. Cuck 088 said to close the lid on little Daisy. It felt a bit odd, but everyone clapped and I went for it. When Daisy first sniffed her new suitcase-turned cushion bed, her tail wagged left, right, like a pendulum on meth. My lifeline, she deserved this treat. Literally, she's the only one who hadn't left my side through my skint days. See, bald prick Mike had no respect for my being on the socials. Too old to get what it takes. He and his pathetic not on the job lad and don't bother coming in. Keep your fake client-facing smiles and minimum wage, Mike. Look who's trending now. Monetizing too. Yeah, I hesitated, but the wisdom of the masses, that's magic. Mum always went to church. Me, I live stream Pack Daisy on Sundays when the clock hits midnight. But you've subscribed, so you know that already. Daisy's been a real sport about it. Must be that bit of Corgi blood in her. What with the suitcases getting smaller and smaller. My mates online came up with that idea. I worried at first. Obviously, I wouldn't want to hurt her. But when I looked at the numbers, holy F-U, skake. And I try to make it snuggly for her in there. Like when Samsonite reached out, I made them line the insides of the trolley with pink velvet and that bakery box complete with luxury dog biscuits. Still, we've had a few bumps, like the time she weed all over that All Saints vintage leather bag when the zipper zipped, or that IKEA plastic container, shoebox sized, bit cramped. I didn't love that, but this is about something bigger than just me and her. She's a brave soul, Daisy, loyal. She knows how important this is, and when she gets bitey, I tell her, love ya, but we can't have a little mutt running a big show, can we? My people voted for a lockbox. You put the thing in, set the time limit, and it shuts. We did 30 seconds for starters, and people went wild watching the countdown. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Slow and steady wins the bloody race. I turned the radio up, louder than the barking, and just watched the dollars pour in. Hear that, Mike? You backwards twat. Master 7Fee5 had a custom lockbox delivered, see-through, pet casket-shaped, 20 minutes in minimum. Sent a taser too, just in case. Daisy pointed her ears when I unboxed it, then started clawing at the corner of the room. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. She's pure gold. Practically a GIF. I made all that into a teaser, uploaded it, and smashed the platform. Yes, your name will be up there on the wall too next time we air. The final drop, but me and you were just getting started. Thanks for your support. Here, Daisy, Daisy, Daisy. Have a little go? Feeling feisty, are we? Come now, it'll be so much better if you go unconscious. Yes, it will. Yes, it will. Just a little taste then? Right, in you go. That's a pup. I rented the same lake house where we vacationed 13 years ago. That was the last summer for the four of us. The seamstress before the kids started drifting away from Stephen and me. The summer of our last real togetherness. We used to find lake glass on those vacations. Fragments of broken bottles and weathered debris transformed by a mythical water nymph, the lake glass woman, who turned trash into treasures. The stories were far more romantic than the truth. Discarded beer bottles and litter smoothed by time and waves. We loved pretending they were water nymphs' tears. That folklore helped create our happiest memories. At home, I had a jar of rare blues, greens, and one extraordinary amber shard, displayed like a shrine on my nightstand. Maybe the kids would want it someday, later. But I had become irrelevant. My children had grown beyond needing me, and I had grown tired of my hollow marriage. My career was just a job, never a calling. Life had been drained of meaning until one night this past spring when I found myself gazing at the glimmering pieces of glass nestled in the jar beside my bed. It hit me then. I finally knew how to fill the emptiness inside me. I told Stephen I needed time away, a solo trip in the fall after we dropped our youngest off at her new apartment. He barely looked up from his phone when he agreed. We had become nothing more than roommates managing logistics. Now, I walk along the lake's edge, feeling the wet sand squish beneath my bare feet. The crisp autumn air bites at my skin. This trip would be my last. Tomorrow, I'd rise early, pour myself a stiff drink, and walk into the lake's icy embrace, letting its cold waters carry me away. Whiskey warms me as I wander hazily from the cabin to the shoreline. The sunset paints the sky in golds and deep purples, its reflection rippling across the glassy water. I take a deep breath and step forward. But something stirs in the lake. A figure rises from the water, feminine, with curves sculpted from glistening shards of lake glass. Her translucent form catches the fading light, a kaleidoscope of blues and greens shimmering as she moves. She strides purposefully toward me, each step deliberate and graceful. I stumble back, the cold sand catching me as I fall. My breath hitches as she looms over me, her violet eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. The lake glass woman crouches and plucks a rusted bottle cap from the ground beside me. She places it between her opalescent lips, her iridescent skin catching the last rays of sunlight. When she removes the cap from her mouth, it has been transformed into a smooth, radiant gem, a brilliant emerald stone. She extends it to me with a serene smile. I take the gem, my hand trembling. The woman tilts her head, her gaze piercing yet kind. Without a word, she turns and walks back into the lake, vanishing beneath the darkening waves. I sit there, stunned, as the stars begin to shimmer above. The gem in my palm feels warm against my skin, a reminder of something I cannot yet name. As the lake swallows the last of the sunset, I take a deep breath of cool, crisp air. My heart feels full for the first time in years. Clutching the emerald gem, I stand and begin the walk back to the cabin. I am not done with this world yet. There is more for me to reclaim. Willowshade is a cursed little village nestled in the misty countryside of Maine, 80 miles north of Portland, near the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Its 4,600 residents live in colonial-era homes that form a crooked ring around a 17th century chapel, as well as in old trailers perched along windswept cliffs. Willowshade's exact origins remain mysterious, and its history is soaked in eerie tales of floods, invasions, and monsters, both mythical and real. Every corner of its sordid past seems touched by the supernatural. The village takes its name from a local legend about a young woman, Lydia Willowshade, the daughter of a Puritan minister. According to the story, Lydia was executed during a witch trial in 1692, but was said to have risen from her grave to curse those who condemned her. In 1765, the town was devastated by a fiery storm that some claimed was caused by a malevolent sea spirit. And in 1837, a lynch mob targeted a family accused of harboring dark secrets, leaving behind a legacy of whispers and shadows. Fast forward to 2005, when 30-year-old sales executive Vanessa Campbell returned to Willowshade to view a house for sale. Number 13 Cedar Lane, also known as the Keep, had a dark past. Once a colonial jail, it had held women accused of witchcraft, including the infamous Agnes Blackwood, who was hanged for allegedly cursing the townsfolk. I remembered seeing the old sign outside, Campbell explained in a recent interview. I didn't feel scared. I grew up around this stuff. Vanessa, with her jet black hair and adventurous spirit, wasn't interested in the bland cookie-cutter apartments most people her age gravitated toward. She wanted something unique, something with a story. The Keep was just that. Though converted into a home in the early 1900s, the building still bore the marks of its grim history. Barred windows, thick stone walls, and iron rings bolted into the basement floor where prisoners had once been shackled. The property had been on the market for months, largely due to its reputation. Rumors abounded, tenants breaking leases, neighbors reporting unexplainable screams at night, and even a recent suicide by one of the previous owners. But to Vanessa, the $150,000 asking price seemed a bargain. I could picture myself living there, fixing it up, maybe even settling down eventually, she said. Having spent over a decade working in sales for luxury vacation properties, Vanessa had cultivated a sharp independence, yet her travels had insulated her from the folklore of her hometown. She was vaguely aware that the narrow alley behind the house was known as Coffin Row, so named for the bodies carried through it during the town's darkest days. She had also heard whispers about a skeleton unearthed near the old chapel, its limbs bound with iron to prevent it from returning to life. Still, these stories felt like quaint local trivia, not red flags. I grew up in an old house too, Vanessa explained. There were always weird noises. It never bothered me. She also admitted she knew little about Agnes Blackwood and the witch trials. To her, the keep's ominous reputation was part of its charm. But soon after moving in, she began to regret her decision. What started as small, almost dismissible occurrences, books sliding off shelves, strange cold drafts, soon escalated into a full-blown nightmare. Vanessa claimed that objects would fly across the room with alarming force, and she began waking up with unexplained bruises and bite marks. Visitors reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the house, and one guest even claimed to have been shoved down the staircase. Within months, Willowshade Keep had become infamous, with paranormal investigators, journalists, and even local clergy trying to make sense of the malevolent presence. John Fraser, a prominent researcher, compared it to the notorious Amityville horror house in Long Island. "This is not just a haunted house," Fraser stated. "It's a vortex of something far darker." Unbeknownst to Vanessa, her dream home was becoming a waking nightmare, one she would soon realize had no easy escape. The shadows at 32 Elmwood Lane stood silent, cloaked in history and secrets. Ava Henderson couldn't wait to move in. On a brisk autumn afternoon in 2005, she and her best friend, Carla Monroe, lugged boxes up the groaning wooden stairs of their new home. The two had grown up in the coastal village of Graywick, Massachusetts, and couldn't have been more different. Ava was bold and headstrong, while Carla, recovering from a grueling battle with leukemia, was lighthearted and easygoing, a natural foil to Ava's intensity. Carla, who worked part-time at a nearby cafe, had heard all the chilling rumors about the shadows. "I remember this one family who lived here," Carla said as she dropped a box on the dusty floor. "Their son swore the house made him do things. He even set his room on fire more than once. People said he was possessed." Ava chuckled nervously, dismissing the stories as exaggerated village gossip. She set about unpacking, plugging in the kettle for a much-needed cup of tea. The shadows retained a rustic charm, its dark wooden beams crisscrossing the walls, whispering of its bygone days. While Carla carried another box inside, Ava was startled by the sound of footsteps behind her. Spinning around, she expected to see her friend, but instead she saw an ominous black mist lingering near the doorway. It dissipated before her eyes, leaving her frozen, her pulse racing. From the kitchen window, Ava watched Carla laughing outside as she struggled to carry a particularly heavy box. Ava swallowed her fear, determined not to alarm her friend. Later, Ava gave Carla a tour of the house. Downstairs, the remnants of its sinister past were unmistakable. A solid wooden door with iron bars, a chilling relic from its days as a colonial holding cell. In the soot-blackened fireplace, Ava discovered an ancient iron hook chained to the wall, a remnant of its days as a jail for criminals awaiting trial. As they cleaned, Ava stumbled upon a stack of yellowed papers in a forgotten corner of the kitchen. Among them was an unsettling discovery: a death certificate. "Oh my God," Ava muttered. "Look at this." Carla leaned over her shoulder to read the document. "This guy, George Hale, hung himself here," Ava said, her voice hushed. "And look at the date, October 27th, just days before Halloween." Carla grimaced. "Great. Just the vibe we need." Their cleaning unearthed more than just paperwork. Underneath an old rug, Ava found a squirming mass of maggots. She screamed, and Carla rushed over. Armed with bleach and determination, the pair scrubbed the floor clean, though the incident left them both unnerved. Other peculiarities quickly made themselves known. The house was perpetually cold, even on mild days. Odd drafts carried the scent of fresh-baked bread, acrid pipe smoke, and something sour that turned Ava's stomach. One morning, shortly after settling in, 3 loud knocks shattered the stillness of the house. When Ava opened the door, a boy stood on the porch. He couldn't have been older than 12, his hair spiked in messy tufts, his school uniform slightly askew. "I'm sorry to bother you," the boy stammered, "but it's tradition, you know?" "Excuse me?" Ava asked, confused. "My grandma, she's a white witch, says you have to knock 3 times when you pass this house. It's to show respect and keep the bad spirits away." He looked genuinely frightened. "Sorry again, I won't bother you." Without waiting for a reply, the boy bolted down the street, disappearing into the shadows of the narrow alleyway. Though odd, Ava found herself charmed by Graywick. Through her bedroom window, she often spotted deer grazing in the nearby meadow. Nights in the village were eerily still. with only the occasional flicker of candlelight breaking the blackness. But Ava's fascination couldn't erase the house's dark history. The shadows had endured centuries of strife, and its walls seemed to hum with restless energy. Carla brushed it off, chalking everything up to overactive imaginations. But Ava couldn't shake the unease that prickled her skin whenever she passed the staircase or lingered in the kitchen. On one particularly quiet evening, Ava found herself flipping through an old book she had uncovered during their cleaning spree. It detailed the history of the area, including a woman named Marjorie Kemp, a midwife from the late 1600s accused of witchcraft. She had lived and died in Greywick, her reputation tarnished by whispers of curses and dark rituals. Ava's finger hovered over a passage. Marjorie Kemp was accused of placing curses that brought harm to her neighbors. Her accusers claimed she spoke incantations to heal, but her cures often came at a price. The uneasy connection between Marjorie Kemp and the shadows felt like a thread pulling tighter, binding Ava to a past she didn't fully understand. She snapped the book shut, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that she wasn't alone. If the rumors were true, the Shadows was more than just a house. It was a crossroads, a place where history, tragedy, and the supernatural converged. The vicar's visit to the cage was intended to bring peace to Vanessa Mitchell and Nicole Kirtley. Reverend Martin Flowerdew arrived on a brisk November morning, his demeanor calm yet curious. He carried a small wooden cross and a leather-bound prayer book. As he stepped inside, his expression changed subtly, as though the air in the cage bore a weight invisible to the naked eye. "This place has a history," he said softly, glancing at the wooden beams and the ominous cage door. Flowerdew began to pray, moving from room to room. He sprinkled holy water, pausing in places where he claimed to feel an oppressive energy. But the atmosphere didn't improve. That night, after Flowerdew's visit, Mitchell and Kirtley both awoke to the sound of heavy breathing in their respective rooms. Mitchell, never one to back down from a confrontation, shouted, "Who's there?" No response, just the slow, deliberate sound of something exhaling in the darkness. The strange occurrences escalated. One evening, while Freddie Young was visiting, he stopped mid-conversation, his face draining of color. "What's wrong?" Mitchell asked. Freddie pointed toward the fireplace, his voice barely a whisper. "There's someone standing there." Mitchell spun around but saw nothing. Kirtley, however, swore she caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure retreating into the corner. The boy, shaken, refused to stay any longer and ran home to his grandmother. Desperate for answers, Mitchell decided to dig deeper into the cage's history. She spent hours poring over old records at the local library and speaking with villagers who had their own chilling tales about the house. One elderly woman recounted a story about a tenant in the 1970s who had fled in the middle of the night after seeing a woman in black sitting at the foot of his bed. "I've lived in this village my whole life," the woman said, "and no one stays in that house for long. You do well to leave it." But leaving wasn't an option. Mitchell had sunk her savings into the property, and Kirtley, recovering from cancer, had nowhere else to go. As winter set in, the disturbances became physical. One night, while washing dishes, Mitchell felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but the kitchen was empty. Kirtley, too, began to experience unexplained bruises on her arms and legs, as though someone had grabbed her in her sleep. "I can't take this anymore," Kirtley sobbed one evening. "This house, it's alive. It doesn't want us here." Mitchell tried to reassure her friend, but deep down she was terrified. She began sleeping with the lights on, but even that provided little comfort. Then came the night that broke her resolve. Around 3 a.m., Mitchell was jolted awake by a loud bang. She rushed downstairs to find the kitchen in disarray. Plates and glasses were shattered on the floor, and the chain by the fireplace swung violently as if an unseen force were yanking it. And then she heard it, a voice, faint and chilling, whispering her name. "Vanessa." She froze, her heart pounding. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Vanessa." Grabbing her phone, she called Kirtley, who was upstairs. "Nicole, are you okay? Did you hear that?" But there was no answer. Panicking, Mitchell raced upstairs, only to find Kirtley huddled in a corner of her room, her face pale and tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's her," Kirtley whispered. "The witch. She's here." The two women fled the house that night, seeking refuge at the king's arms. As they sat in the dim-lit pub, surrounded by the comforting hum of locals, Mitchell made a decision. "We have to find out what she wants," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This isn't just a haunting. It's a warning. And if we don't figure it out, it's going to destroy us." With the help of Freddie's grandmother, a local historian, and a paranormal investigator from Essex, Mitchell and Kirtley embarked on a quest to uncover the cage's darkest secrets. But the deeper they delved, the more they realized that the cage wasn't just haunted by the spirits of its tragic past. It was a portal, and something far more sinister was trying to break through. Vanessa Mitchell's departure from the cage did not mark the end of its haunting legacy. In fact, her leaving seemed to intensify the house's sinister grip on those who dared cross its threshold. Determined to turn her misfortune into an opportunity, Mitchell attempted to rent the cage to a friend from the village. However, her plans unraveled almost immediately. The prospective tenant, wary of the cage's dark reputation, hired a psychic to cleanse the property before moving in. The psychic, upon entering the courtyard, abruptly refused to proceed, her face pale with unease. "There is something here that does not want to leave," she murmured before hastily retreating. That friend backed out of the arrangement. Mitchell's next tenants, a young couple with an infant, managed to endure only 2 months before fleeing without explanation. The revolving door of renters continued, with no one lasting long enough to establish even a semblance of normalcy. Desperate for help, Mitchell reached out to the local church, only to discover that the vicar, Reverend Flowerdew, had abruptly transferred to a parish over 200 miles away. The official reason was stress, though rumors swirled about an incident involving a block of concrete smashing through his car windshield. In a candid interview with a local newspaper, Flowerdew admitted to suffering a nervous breakdown, an event he attributed to the relentless pressure of something unseen but oppressive lingering in St. Osyth. As financial pressures mounted, Mitchell decided to confront the cage's infamous reputation head-on. In 2010, she contacted the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, a venerable organization dedicated to investigating paranormal phenomena. John Fraser, a leading member of SPR's Spontaneous Cases Committee, visited the cage and conducted an extensive series of interviews with Mitchell, her friends, and former residents. Fraser found the testimonies compelling, drawing parallels between the cage and notorious poltergeist cases like Amityville, with one key difference. The cage stands out because the accounts come from multiple credible witnesses, Fraser noted. Among them were professionals like Liz Williams, a cancer nurse, and Claire Young, now a school teacher, whose calm demeanor lent weight to their unsettling recollections. Fraser's investigations also revealed disturbing physical effects experienced by visitors. A female investigator reported angry red marks appearing on her legs after an overnight vigil, which were later diagnosed as burn-like blisters by a medical professional. Kim Sondergaard, a Danish paranormal researcher, described being overcome by an intense wave of sadness while standing in the courtyard. "I broke down and cried uncontrollably," he recounted in a recorded testimony, adding that he left with unexplained bruises on his arms. The cage's reputation soon attracted amateur ghost hunters from across England. Equipped with Ouija boards, spirit boxes, and night vision cameras, they descended on the property, eager to document the supernatural. Sensing a commercial opportunity, Mitchell began renting the cage for ghost hunts, charging visitors £35 per night. The British tabloids quickly took notice, dubbing it Britain's most haunted house. Sensational headlines followed. One article claimed a retired police officer had photographed spectral figures in Coffin Alley, while another featured images of witch-like faces and a supposed satanic goat. Yet not everyone was convinced. Documentary filmmaker Colin Werland dismissed the supernatural claims as exaggerated. "She's made quite a bit of money out of this," he remarked skeptically. "It's hard to separate fact from fiction." Werland's doubts deepened after consulting archaeologist Jacqueline McKinley, who examined the supposed skeleton of Ursula Kemp, unearthed years earlier in St. Osyth. McKinley's findings were unequivocal. The remains were not of a female witch, but of a man, and the iron spikes accompanying the bones were recent embellishments intended to fuel the legend. Further revelations came from Paul Brooker, the grandson of Charles Brooker, who had initially discovered the skeleton. In a candid confession to the Clacton and Frinton Gazette, Paul admitted, "Granddad added the nails to make it more dramatic." In 2012, the bones were reburied in unconsecrated ground during a solemn ceremony attended by both pagan and Christian representatives. Despite this symbolic gesture, the cage's dark aura persisted. Unexplained phenomena continued to plague the property. The King's Arms pub, a local gathering spot, saw its regular patrons dwindle to none, leading to its eventual closure. Then, in 2016, an inexplicable car accident on Colchester Road brought the cage back into the spotlight. The driver of a BMW swerved off course, crashing directly into the building. Shaken but unharmed, he claimed to have no recollection of what caused him to lose control. To Mitchell, it was yet another sign that the cage's malevolence extended beyond its walls. By the end of the decade, Mitchell's financial woes forced her to sell the property. She listed it with a realtor who leaned into the house's infamous history, staging it with broomsticks and books about witchcraft. In January 2020, she finally accepted an offer of £224,000. Though the sale brought some relief, Mitchell's profits were eroded by years of mounting debts, legal fees, and property taxes. The new owner, a divorcee hoping for a fresh start, brushed aside Mitchell's warnings about the cage's cursed history. "She doesn't believe in ghosts at all," Mitchell remarked, a note of both pity and relief in her voice. For her, the sale marked the end of an ordeal that had defined more than a decade of her life, though she doubted the cage's restless spirits would ever truly be at peace. Vanessa Mitchell had finally made up her mind. She could no longer endure the torment of the cage. Every moment spent in the haunted house was a test of her sanity and survival. By summer 2008, she had resolved to leave for good, but the spirits within the cage seemed unwilling to let her go so easily. On her last night in the cage, Vanessa returned to the empty house to gather the final boxes of her belongings. The atmosphere inside felt heavier than ever, as though the house itself resented her departure. The old beams creaked under the weight of an unnatural stillness, and the faint scent of burnt wood wafted through the air. A cruel reminder of the fire that had once consumed the home of Charles Brooker, the man who had profited from the skeleton's grim legacy. As Vanessa stepped into the prison room, she was overcome by an oppressive chill. The dim light from her torch danced on the stone walls, casting eerie shadows. She hurriedly packed the last few items into a box, her every movement punctuated by the feeling of unseen eyes boring into her. Suddenly, the room darkened further, as though a heavy shadow had passed over her. "Leave," a deep voice whispered behind her. Vanessa froze, too terrified to turn around. The whisper grew louder, now a chorus of voices overlapping, all commanding the same thing: "Leave." Her pulse racing, Vanessa grabbed the box and bolted from the room. She didn't stop until she was outside, the box clutched tightly in her trembling arms. But as she loaded the box into the van, she glanced back at the cage and saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, a woman dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, her hollow eyes fixed on Vanessa with a look of unrelenting malice. The move to her friend's house brought no immediate relief. Vanessa found herself haunted not by the spirits of the cage, but by vivid nightmares and a lingering sense of dread. On one particularly stormy night, she awoke to a violent pounding on the bedroom door. For a moment, she thought she was back in the cage. But when she opened the door, there was no one there, only the sound of wind howling through the trees outside. Determined to rid herself of the cage's grip, Vanessa sought help from local mediums and paranormal investigators. One medium, an elderly woman named Agnes, visited the house and confirmed Vanessa's worst fears. "This place is a portal," Agnes declared after walking through the cage. "The spirits here are restless because they were never given peace. You're lucky to have left when you did." Agnes advised Vanessa to hold a cleansing ritual to sever her connection to the house. Desperate for closure, Vanessa followed the instructions, burning sage and reciting prayers late into the night. Though the ritual brought her a measure of comfort, she couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits of the cage would always be a part of her. Months later, Vanessa returned to the cage one last time, this time with a television crew for a paranormal documentary. She hoped that by sharing her story, she might finally achieve some closure. As the crew set up their equipment, strange phenomena began almost immediately. Cameras malfunctioned, lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. During an interview in the prison room, Vanessa recounted her most terrifying experiences. As she spoke, the camera operator suddenly gasped and pointed to the corner of the room. Everyone turned to see a dark shadow moving along the wall, only to vanish a moment later. The crew hurried to pack up their gear, unwilling to linger any longer than necessary. Years later, Vanessa would reflect on her time in the cage with a mix of fear and disbelief. The house remained unsold for a long time, its sinister reputation scaring off potential buyers. Eventually, it was purchased by a paranormal enthusiast who embraced its haunted history, turning it into a site for ghost tours and investigations. For Vanessa, however, the cage was a chapter she wished to close forever. She focused on raising her son and rebuilding her life, though she never forgot the harrowing experiences that had pushed her to the brink. "The cage took a piece of me," she would later say in interviews, "but it also made me stronger. I survived what most people would never believe, and that's something no ghost can ever take away." The divorcee who purchased the cage, Eleanor Hart, was a pragmatic woman in her early 50s. A seasoned professional in corporate finance, she viewed the tales surrounding the cage as nothing more than provincial folklore. She envisioned transforming the property into a peaceful retreat for herself and a lucrative rental space for tourists eager to visit a village steeped in history. "Every old house has its quirks," she remarked during a brief interview with a local paper. "What matters is turning a profit, not pandering to ghost stories." Eleanor's confidence seemed unshakable as she moved into the cage in late December. She spent the first few weeks overseeing renovations, determined to modernize the interior while retaining its historical charm. Contractors came and went, each with their own peculiar stories. A carpenter claimed his tools vanished only to reappear hours later in a completely different room. A painter swore he heard whispers when he worked alone. Eleanor dismissed the incidents as tricks of the mind. The first night Eleanor stayed in the cage, she felt an overwhelming chill despite the central heating running at full capacity. She wrapped herself in a blanket and poured a glass of wine, telling herself it was just an old house settling into its new chapter. But as the hours dragged on, the chill turned into an oppressive weight. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. Eleanor's sleep that night was restless. Her dreams were vivid and unsettling, filled with shadowy figures and the faint sound of chains dragging across stone. She woke up at 3:33 a.m. to the sound of a baby crying, a sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She searched the house, her heart pounding, but found nothing. The next morning, Eleanor chalked it up to exhaustion and refused to entertain any notions of the supernatural. But over the following weeks, the disturbances escalated. Lights flickered without explanation. Doors slammed shut on their own. Eleanor began to feel a distinct presence in the house, particularly in the room she had designated as her home office. One evening, as she worked late on her laptop, the screen flickered and went black. When it powered back on, the words "Get out" were scrawled across a blank document. Eleanor stared at the screen, frozen, before slamming the laptop shut. Her skepticism began to waver after she invited a friend, Paula, to stay for the weekend. Paula was an amateur paranormal enthusiast who had long been fascinated by the stories surrounding the cage. Armed with a spirit box and a digital recorder, Paula conducted an impromptu investigation. The results were chilling. The spirit box emitted disjointed voices, including one that clearly whispered, "Help me." When Paula played back the recordings, both women heard a deep, guttural growl that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Despite these experiences, Eleanor refused to leave. She was determined to confront whatever force lingered in the cage. She began researching the history of the property in greater depth, uncovering stories that hadn't been widely reported. One account spoke of a midwife in the 1600s who was accused of witchcraft after a newborn in her care mysteriously died. Another told of a soldier from the English Civil War who was imprisoned in the cage and later executed, his ghost rumored to haunt the property seeking justice. Eleanor enlisted the help of a renowned paranormal investigator, Dr. Evelyn Carter, whose methods were both scientific and empathetic. Dr. Carter arrived with a small team equipped with thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and audio recorders. Over the course of 3 nights, the team documented an array of phenomena: sudden temperature drops, unexplained orbs of light, and disembodied voices calling Eleanor's name. Dr. Carter concluded that the cage was a nexus of residual and intelligent hauntings. The energy here is undeniable, she told Eleanor. Whatever lingers in this house is deeply tied to its history of suffering and injustice. Eleanor faced a choice: sell the cage once again, knowing the stigma would make it nearly impossible to find another buyer, or remain and attempt to coexist with the unseen forces. She chose the latter. In the months that followed, Eleanor adapted to life in the cage. She established boundaries with whatever entities resided there, speaking aloud to announce her presence and requesting peace. Remarkably, the disturbances lessened, though they never completely disappeared. Visitors to the cage continue to report strange occurrences, but Eleanor has grown accustomed to the house's eccentricities. "It's not a haunted house," she often says. "It's a house with a history, and like any history, it demands respect." Whether the cage's story ends with Eleanor remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: the echoes of its past are far from silent.